Piedade Beach in Brazil's northeastern city of Greater Recife is known as a shark hotspot. Since 1992, there have been 62 shark attacks, of which 25 have been fatal. But the draw of the ocean is ever present with the white sandy beaches and calm blue waters. Lifeguards patrol the seas, scanning the water for any signs of distress, but even they cannot prevent a shark attack. On October 14, 2002, 36-year-old Luis Soares de Arruda headed to the beach with his 14-year-old son and 10-year-old daughter. Little did he know that it would be the last time the three of them took a dip together. There were others in the sea, but it was Luis who was about to be the target of an apex predator. A tiger shark was swimming parallel to the beach. Its dark shadow just below the surface went unnoticed. It glided along, seeking out prey. It could sense the vibrations from the beachgoers. It was curious and swam in for a closer look. The splashes and shouts from those playing in the sea could have been mistaken for an animal in distress, something that the shark may consider as food. Luis and his children swam to about 20 meters or 60 feet from the shore. They were enjoying the cool water. The air temperature was dropping as afternoon was drawing to a close, but the sun was still high in the sky. The shark had spotted the three of them. It now changed course and made a beeline for the young family. Luis was unaware of what swam below him, but there had already been 5 shark attacks in that area alone that year. Signs had been erected along the beaches to warn people of the dangers, and yet they still swam in the sea. Being so close to shore gave a false sense of security to so many. People often assume that wading in waist-high water means that they are less likely to be attacked. But sharks can drive themselves onto the sand in pursuit of prey. They frequent the shallows, as that is sometimes where shoals of fish swim. Luis was now swimming in chest-high water. He could still stand on the bottom and paused his swimming every now and then to talk and laugh with his kids. However, with a tiger shark prowling the coastal waters that day in October, nobody in the water was safe. After swimming for 10 minutes or so, the shark advanced towards Luis. He was in front of his 2 children, and suddenly there was a sharp tug on one of his legs. He let out a cry of alarm, and his 2 children froze. In front of them, they saw a large, dark gray dorsal fin. It was just a couple of feet away from their father, and when he started struggling in the water, the children realized that the shark had got him. It tugged him under the surface momentarily, but Luis fought back. He kicked with all his might, trying to shake the animal off him. He came back up briefly and desperately waved his arms above his head. Those on the beach stood still, shocked by what they were seeing. Luis's 2 children screamed as the water around their father turned red. They couldn't do anything. They couldn't help. For a few terrifying moments, they were frozen in fear, unable to move. They could see the fear in their father's eyes. There was a splash and a swirl in the water. A large gray hump emerged out of the water. It was the shark's back. The sun glistened off the skin before it dived back down, dragging Luis with it. His children made a mad dash for the shore. They dare not look back behind them for fear of what they might see. Was the shark coming for them now too? It had disappeared from sight. The terrifying thought that it might pop up next to them, or that they would feel a sharp tug on their leg, came into their heads, but mercifully, they made it to the beach. When they turned around to look for their father, there was no sign of him. It was as if nothing had happened. It had all been so quick. One moment, Luis was swimming with his children. The next, he was pulled under by an enormous shark. Although time seemed to stand still during the whole attack, and the memory of seeing their desperate father will play out in the minds of his children over and over again, the attack only lasted about 5 seconds. It was determined to be a predatory attack. The shark hadn't attacked out of a case of mistaken identity. This time, the shark had seen potential prey and made a deliberate attempt to take it down. As the minutes ticked by, the hope that Luis had somehow survived the ordeal faded. Emergency crews were scrambled to the location. They took to the water, scouring the sea for any sign of the father. As the maritime group of the Pernambuco Fire Department motored their boat along the shoreline, they could see a thick blood stain in the water that stretched for 5 meters. It was clear that Luis had likely bled to death by now, or he had drowned. When evening drew in, all hope was lost for Luis. The following morning, the search continued, but now the fire department were looking for any remains of the victim. Near where the attack occurred, a chunk of body was found washed up on the beach. It was thought to be part of Luis's hip. It was a grotesque finding and hugely traumatic for his family. Only a month before, a 19-year-old student was attacked on the same beach. He was lucky enough to survive the ordeal, but his leg was amputated as a result. Following the dangerous and deadly attacks that seemed to plague that particular stretch of Brazil's coastline, the City Council of Recife proposed closing a 2-kilometer stretch of the beach. This was considered unnecessary by shark and marine experts. Netting off a large section of the water would likely move the problem on elsewhere. Instead, councilors suggested that a greater effort was made to educate people about sharks and the dangers of swimming in the area. It considered marking the particularly dangerous areas off with buoys so that people were aware exactly where the shark attack hotspot was, and they also deemed it necessary to purchase a boat armed with a harpoon that would patrol the waters and slay any sharks that came too close to shore. Luis's death was a terrible tragedy, but there have continued to be shark attacks along the 12.5-mile coastline of Greater Recife. More recently, in 2021, a man was mauled by a shark when he went to urinate in the sea. 51-year-old Marcelo Rocha Santos had been drinking with friends when he waded into the surf with a friend. The water came up to just below their waists as they relieved themselves. Moments later, a shark leapt from the water, severing Marcelo's hand and taking a bite out of his leg. He was pulled to the beach by his friend, but died at the scene. In 2023, terror reigned once more. On March 5th, a 14-year-old girl was attacked and lost her leg. Remarkably, the very next day, on March 6th, another teenage girl, Kaylane Timoteo Freitas, was dragged from the water by lifeguards after being attacked by a shark. The shark severed her left arm. She was airlifted to hospital and survived the terrifying ordeal. Even as she was carried away in a stretcher, people remained in the sea. Lifeguards had the unenviable task of wading into the water to remove people. It is little wonder why that stretch of Brazil's coastline has earned it a top spot in the top 10 for most shark-infested beaches. Locals believe that the construction of the relatively new Soape port is to blame. During construction, water flow from 3 rivers into the sea was diverted. This blocked the typical routes taken by sharks, and now, to make the same journeys as before, the sharks need to swim closer to shore. With so many people enjoying the water, human-shark encounters at Piedade Beach are now considered common, with many more expected to meet their terrifying final affliction. 25-year-old Peter Sabino was an avid swimmer who was studying at the California Polytechnic Institute in 1957. During his time at college, he attended and organized many swimming events, gradually becoming very close friends with 22-year-old David Hogan, whom he would regularly arrange swimming trips with. Living in California came with the benefits of easy access to beautiful beaches and empty oceans, so they were usually pretty undisturbed when they would organize these longer swimming trips. The group preferred to take part in longer swims, ones that weaker swimmers would not be able to keep up with, something that was never a problem for those who swam with Peter. There were many shark species thought to be in these waters, but they had never come across any themselves, and so the idea of a shark attack was not even a thought for this group. They just intended to swim for the afternoon before continuing with their studies later that day. Unfortunately, on April 28th, it would be Peter that was unable to keep up with his friend this day, ending in his tragic demise. On that fateful day, Peter organized a swim with Daniel and 10 other student acquaintances for an early afternoon swim. They decided to go down near Morro Rock, a popular location due to its stunning scenery with a 576-foot-tall rock in the distance. It lived up to its dramatic atmosphere with rough oceans surrounding the rock and strong currents that would need to be avoided at all costs. But the biggest risk to the group wasn't factored in that day: the ever-growing presence of sharks in the area. During the 1950s, it was harder for people to identify different species of sharks as they were less exposed to the kind of media that we have today. The different species of sharks and how to properly identify them were relatively unknown to the average person. That being said, there were unusually high amounts of instances and reports of great white sharks in the area during the time, so it is assumed that this was the species that was hunting in Morro Bay on the day of their swim. Before entering the water at around 1 p.m., the group was excited to find that the conditions were perfect. The weather was warm and the sea looked crystal clear, albeit a little rough, but that's the way they liked it. They all jumped in and started to swim, all separating into their friend groups as they usually would. Peter and Daniel swam off from the others, deciding to test out some of the deeper waters. They were both very strong swimmers, but weren't prepared for the strong tides that started pulling them further and further from the shore. They shouted to the rest of the group for help, but they couldn't hear them. The men were all alone. They suddenly found themselves nearly 500 meters out to sea with no hope. They would be forced to try to fight the tide and swim back to the shore. The trouble with swimming against the tide is that a person will quickly become exhausted and risk drowning. Despite being strong swimmers, the current was taking them backwards faster than they could swim towards the shore. Fighting against the retreating tide, they were being overpowered by the waves, and all of their strength was being used just to swim in place and barely covering any ground at all. Daniel was pulling ahead slightly, but in doing so was leaving Peter behind. Peter was becoming increasingly tired, and as his muscles began to cramp from the strain, he worried that he wouldn't be able to carry on. To save his friend, Daniel knew that he would need to help him, and so offered Peter his shoulder to hold as they pushed through the waves together. This seemed to work for a short time, as their combined efforts pushed them closer and closer to shore. Suddenly, the waves began to grow and crash around them, making it harder for them to push forward. Peter was struck by a particularly large wave, and he was quickly lost under the water. Peter had already been struggling and was growing weaker by the second. When he was pulled under the surface, he initially feared that his body had simply given up and he was no longer able to swim, coming to terms with his fate. This was not the case. The acceptance was quickly replaced with pain as he felt his skin begin to tear from his arm. It was a pain like no other he had ever experienced, and knew that something must have grabbed him. He had heard the stories of sharks in the area, but had never believed them until right now. He tore his arm from the shark's jaws and swam back to the surface, thankful that he had escaped, but worried about what would lay in wait for him next. Meanwhile, Daniel tried searching for him and saw a growing surge of red appearing in the water. Peter emerged all of a sudden, shouting that there was a shark and that he had just been bitten. He raised his arm out of the water to show Daniel, who was frozen in shock. His skin was hanging off from his arm, and his hand was almost completely severed. They knew they had to get out of there quickly, as the blood from Peter's hand would surely attract more sharks to attack them. Peter held on to Daniel again as they fought against the waves together. That's when Daniel spotted the shark racing towards them once again. He had no time to react and prayed that he wouldn't be taken next. The shark seemed confused by the movements around it and the growing amount of blood surrounding the animal. It gave the pair more time to escape, and Daniel decided their only chance was for him to drag Peter back to shore, hoping to put enough space between them and the shark so that it would either lose interest in them or just be unable to find them. They managed to create some distance and couldn't see any sign of the shark, so Daniel was hopeful that they had escaped and just had to focus on getting back to shore and getting Peter the help that he needed. He was getting paler as time went on and was relying on Daniel even more, slowing them down as they were fighting against the current at the same time. Daniel tried to keep talking to Peter to keep him awake, but also needed to maintain his only strength, as he was now the only chance that they had of surviving. After a few minutes of silently struggling, Daniel looked back to check on Peter after realizing he couldn't feel him hanging onto him anymore. To his horror, he couldn't see his friend anywhere. He stopped swimming and searched the surface of the water for him to no avail, and began to fear for the worst. He dipped under the waves and searched below him, hoping that he had just slipped under the surface, but he was nowhere to be seen. There was nothing for him to do, no sign that he was ever with another person, aside from the slight tinge of red that Peter's blood had left in his absence. Daniel decided that he would have to return to shore alone and try to find help. Maybe they would have more luck finding his friend. After an exhausting ordeal and a draining swim, Daniel finally made it back to shore. He pulled himself onto the sand and shouted for help, a call that one of his swim group members answered and came to his aid. He explained to him what had happened and how they needed to find someone to report the death that he'd just witnessed. They called the mortuary together, and the police were soon on the scene, taking statements from everyone who had last seen Peter. They sent boats out to search the water, but they also weren't able to see anything. They couldn't even see any sign of a shark in the water. There was nothing to be seen at all. But Daniel knew what he saw. He told the investigators about the 6-meter shark that attacked his friend, but they decided that it must have been a basking shark due to its size. In modern times, we know this would be very unlikely, as basking sharks are relatively calm animals and don't attack humans. As their shark knowledge was quite limited in the 50s, it's understandable why they would have come to this conclusion, but other investigators were quick to correct this. They believed it must have been a great white shark instead, as the attack strategy and ferocity described matched the behavior of a great white shark. Regardless, the shark that attacked Peter was never found, and Peter's family were left without any closure of their son's terrifying final affliction. Lauren Van Wart was 44 years old. She worked in the math editorial team for Curriculum Associates, a Boston-based company that provides resources for teachers. In December 2023, she and her husband, Ernest, headed for a vacation in the Bahamas. Their destination was the Sandals Royal Bahamian Resort on Cable Beach in western New Providence, the most populated island. The hotel was a luxury 5-star resort, exclusively for adults. Lauren and Ernest had been married for 13 years, and this was the perfect break for them. They had been looking forward to this incredible trip for some time now, and it had finally arrived. Set on the pristine white flowery beach, the Grand Hotel is surrounded by palm trees and glistening turquoise waters. It looks like paradise, but beneath the waves lies a hidden danger, one that everyone knows about, but most people ignore: sharks. The Bahamas is known for its incredible shark activity. It is an international hub for it, drawing shark divers from all around the world to come and experience the biodiversity on offer. The waters are rich in marine life, sustaining everything from coral reefs, plankton and sea turtles to whales, dolphins, manatees, and sharks. In fact, the Bahamas created the first shark sanctuary in the Atlantic Ocean in 2011, and more than 40 different species are known to swim through the area. The tourism that sharks bring in exceeds $100 million every year for the Bahamian economy. But swimming in such shark-rich waters also poses a serious risk. With winters setting in over Boston and temperatures regularly dipping below freezing, Lauren and Ernest had decided that some winter sun would be something to look forward to. Located just 150 miles off the coast of Florida, the Bahamas is a popular destination for sun-seeking Americans, especially during the winter months. It offers a tropical getaway without the need for a long-haul flight. Lauren was popular in her Lowell neighborhood. She and Ernest had lived there in the same house for over a decade. They knew many of the people in the area, and whenever Lauren was out walking their dog, she would always wave to her neighbors or greet them with her broad smile. Now, as the two of them arrived at the Sandals Resort, the excitement was building. They had a week of luxury to enjoy, and were going to make the most of it. After breakfast, on Monday, December 4th, 2023, Lauren and Ernest headed down to the hotel's beach. The sky was overcast, with the sun occasionally peeping out behind the clouds. The temperature was around 25 degrees Celsius, 77 degrees Fahrenheit. Kayaks, snorkeling gear, and paddleboards were available for guests to use, inclusive of their stay. Lauren and Ernest opted to take the paddleboards out that morning. They each grabbed one and a single long-handled paddle and waded out into the pristine turquoise water. It was calm, barely a ripple on the surface. Carefully, they balanced themselves and stood up on their boards. The water lapped gently over the sides as they propelled themselves across the surface of the bay. They made their way away from the shore, and the water turned darker blue. Below them, they could see the dark shadows of submerged rocks and corals and the sandy bottom in between. Looking back at the resort, they could see the other guests walking along the sand, lying on the sunbeds, or swimming in the warm waters. Lauren and Ernest headed further out and towards the end of the beach, and heading behind the back of the hotel. With each pull on the paddle, they glided over the water effortlessly. They were now 3/4 of a mile out, and were just about to head back towards shore when the most terrifying thing happened. In the deep waters of the bay, they were very much in shark territory. Below them, a shark circled. It could see the outline of the boards above it on the water. The paddles that were dipped into the water every so often could easily be mistaken for a flipper of a seal, the shark's typical prey. It made a beeline for Lauren's board and torpedoed upwards through the water column. Just as it made impact, it opened its jaws wide and its eyes rolled back in its head. It smacked into Lauren's paddleboard and sent her crashing into the water. The board flipped over, and Lauren's paddle flew from her hand. She didn't know what had happened at first, and when she came up for air, she immediately splashed around, pulling herself back to her board. But Ernest had seen the whole thing. He had seen an enormous shadow just below the surface a split second before Lauren was struck, and now it came back for more. Before Lauren could get out of the water, the shark came at her again. It opened its jaws and bit into her side. The force was immense as it crushed down around her. She screamed, and Ernest yelled for help. He was watching the attack on his wife unfold, and there was nothing he could do. He frantically paddled over to her. The water frothed and boiled all around Lauren as she desperately tried to stay afloat. The shark shook its head from side to side, and Lauren screamed as she was shaken violently in the jaws of the enormous predator. Back on the beach at the resort, other holidaymakers heard the screams and looked out over the water. They could see the two paddleboarders in distress and watched open-mouthed when they realized what was happening. A lifeguard leapt into action. He jumped into a rescue boat and fired up the engine. Then he powered towards the stranded couple, bouncing over the sea at full throttle. When he arrived, he could still see the shark just below the water's surface, the eerie shadow as it circled close by. It was enormous, longer than a boat. It was still interested in the couple and still posed a significant threat. The lifeguard needed to get them out of there as quickly as possible before the shark attacked again. He leaned over the side and pulled Lauren aboard. He then held out his hand and Ernest jumped into the boat. But Lauren was unresponsive. She had a catastrophic bite out of her right side and hip, and her right arm was severely mauled. The shark had bitten through muscle and blood vessels, and she had lost a staggering amount of blood in that moment. It had all happened so quickly. The shark had remained close by, possibly waiting for its prey to succumb to the deadly bite before continuing its attack. This is a common tactic they use to avoid being bitten themselves when preying on the likes of sea lions. But that initial bite had proved fatal for Lauren. Despite the best efforts of the lifeguard and Ernest, CPR could not bring Lauren back, and she succumbed to her injuries. An ambulance had already been called, and when they arrived back at the beach, Lauren was carried across the sand on a stretcher and taken to hospital. But it was too late. tragically, she hadn't made it, and the terrifying attack sent shockwaves through those who witnessed it. Staff and holidaymakers at the resort were traumatized by what they had witnessed, and the news of the horrific incident spread to her hometown, where neighbors were deeply saddened by the incident. While fatal shark attacks are extremely rare, with, on average, 10 occurring globally each year, Lauren was one of 2 women to have died from a shark attack within a single week. She was incredibly unlucky, and taking the paddleboard out an hour or 2 later likely would not have resulted in such a terrible and tragic loss of life. The species of shark responsible for Lauren's death was not identified. A shark diving guide published by Sandals Resorts advertises the opportunity to swim and dive with sharks in the surrounding waters. These are described largely as docile species, but it is also well known that some of the most feared sharks frequent the Bahamian waters. These include the likes of tiger sharks and bull sharks, both known for their aggression. The Bahamas Sanctuary, spanning more than 243,000 square miles, is known as the shark diving capital of the world. Although attacks are rare given the number of people who enter the water each year, when we do so, we are entering the territory where at any moment a shark can take you to your terrifying final affliction. Thaddeus and Anna Kubinski had lived in Boca Ciega Bay since 1984. Thaddeus's job at a large manufacturing company and his smart investments allowed him to retire early at the age of 53. And so began the next 16 years of Thad and Anna's dream retirement. They threw themselves into remodeling and extending their home on the bay, where it sat overlooking the Florida Ocean. Anna's home was filled on most weekends with one of their 5 children stopping by to visit, and later their visits were even fuller when the grandchildren arrived. She was a part of book clubs and charities, and Thad liked to golf and tinker in the garage on projects that he was in no hurry to finish. But one thing was consistent in their lazy, unplanned days, and that was the pair's morning swim. Unless one of them was down with the sniffles, they didn't even miss their morning exercise even if they had a house full of visitors. Anna was a little cautious of the water. After all, Florida has its share of sharks, and even the occasional alligator that got turned around and ended up at the beach somehow. Thad would have swum out as far into the deep as his arms could carry him, but to keep Anna's fears at bay, and to ensure that she'd share the morning swim with him, he agreed to keep their dips to the shallow water around the jetty that was situated right next to the yacht yard where the other neighborhood retirees parked their seagoing vessels. At 7, they took a short 20-minute walk to the jetty from their home, jumped in and did a few laps for 40 minutes before heading home at around 8. They never went farther than a few yards from the shoreline, and the water right near the jetty was only 5 feet deep. They really couldn't have chosen a safer spot to get their morning exercise in. It was about keeping fit after all, not how deep and far they could go. And for 16 years, all was well. Their morning swim was never interrupted by any sign of danger. That's until the year 2000. Like they did every morning, the two walked to the jetty. Anna smiled when Thaddeus ran ahead and took a spectacular dive into the shallows. Even at 69, he was still quick on his feet and as eager to stay active as he was when they first got married in their 20s. Anna took the less impressive route and got into the water from the little ladder that was attached to the side of the jetty. But that splash was the start of a terrible string of events. Right at the moment that Thad hit the water, a 9-foot, 400-pound tiger shark was skimming the shallows, looking for its morning meal. Pickings had been slim the night before, and it was drawn closer to shore by the smells that the fishermen left behind when they threw the intestines overboard after they cleaned their first catches. Poor Thad just happened to dive in just 2 yards away from where the shark was, and that splash sent it into its instinctual hunting mode. There was a living creature in the water, and as far as it was concerned, a meal was a meal, especially if it jumped practically gift-wrapped right in front of it. Anna's left foot touched the mild water, her eyes still on her husband's back as he swam away in an easy freestyle stroke when the telltale fin sliced through the water toward Thad at breakneck speed. Her eyes went wide, and she started to shout a warning, but it happened so fast that she didn't even get a sound out before the monster reared its open jaws out of the water, bearing down into Thad's left side. Thad was propelled several feet toward the jetty with the force that the animal drove into him. He looked like a rag doll driving through the water. The scene only lasted for a second. Thad was driven down below the surface, and then the shark's razor teeth ripped through him completely, taking his entire left abdomen, liver, and shards of Thad's ribcage in one single bite. Thad floated to the surface already unconscious. It came so fast and so hard that he didn't get a chance to compute exactly what was happening. All he felt was the immense hit and the pressure in his side and the mouthful of salt water that he swallowed. The bite was so massive that it dumped more than half of his life's blood into the sea before Thad's head bobbed up again. The massive mouth made an almost perfect half-moon shape from Thad's armpit right down to his hip. It tore through flesh and bone like it was nothing. One clean bite, and Thad's left abdomen was taken clean out. Whatever was left inside the cavity spilled out into the surf. Anna was out before Thad's dark head reappeared back up to the surface, running along the jetty, screaming for help. In seconds, other morning swimmers, yacht owners, and fishermen were at the scene. An older man grabbed Anna, holding her shaking body close to his, while a crowd of 8 people stormed to the jetty. When they got there, the shark had turned tail and was heading right back to the limp and pale body that was floating on the surface in a pool of red. Without hesitation, they all simultaneously jumped in, screaming and slapping the surface as they drew closer to Thad. Had Anna gone in after her husband, it's almost certain that she would have been targeted next. But 8 men weren't as easy a target as one lone woman. The animal wasn't an idiot. Whatever the pale creatures were, there were far too many of them storming at it for it to take the chance to have one last bite. It fled to the deep before any of the men could identify the species. They hauled the bleeding man onto the platform. The others that didn't jump in after Thad were already on the line with 911. But the situation became starkly clear when they laid Thad out on the jetty. There was no way that an ambulance would arrive in time. Thad's eyes were rolled in the back of his head. His breathing was shallow and gargled, and from the gaping hole on his side spilled what little was left of his intestines. It looked like his side had been scooped neatly out by a jagged spoon, but they tried to contain his organs and the blood as best they could, no matter how dire the reality was. They didn't jump into the ocean risking their lives to save Thad just so they could give up now. Thad gave one last labored breath and died less than a minute after they'd pulled him out of the sea. Still, they held on, putting pressure on the gaping wound, hoping for a miracle. 15 minutes later, the ambulance arrived, but they only had to pick up the already cooling remains of Thaddeus. The man who held Anna pressed her face into his chest, whispering in her ear that she shouldn't look, as the EMTs carried the broken and shredded corpse of her husband past them. This man, a stranger just a few minutes ago, took Anna to the hospital in his own car and asked about her children and their contact details as they drove. Anna was in such a state that she could barely string 2 words together without bursting into tears, but it was enough to give him what he needed to find at least some of her children. While Anna was treated for shock, he managed to locate 2 of her sons based on the information she'd given him, and he stayed with her until they arrived in the early hours of the next day. That man, also a retiree, happened to live just a block away from the Kubinski residence, and as gruesome as the circumstances were, it was what led him and his own wife to befriend the family. If it weren't for the couple, Anna would have never survived that first year after being widowed in such a brutal and visceral way. Her children and grandchildren visited more often than they normally would have, preferring to keep Anna as occupied as possible with those that were still living. But on the occasion when they couldn't, Anna's new friends were there to pick up the reins. But even with all of the support rallied around her, it took Anna years before the nightmares left her. She described the whole event like a scene out of Jaws, and the image of her beloved Thad being torn to pieces right in front of her never really left her, even though the nightmares eventually faded away. Anna did say she was thankful that the beast at least left Thad's face intact so that she could see him one last time in the pathologist's cold rooms. His body was covered up to his neck in a white sheet so that she couldn't see the horrific gaping wound on his side. But at least she got one last look at the love of her life before saying goodbye to him forever after his terrifying final affliction. For 15-year-old Kai Cowley, surfing was in his blood. He was a third-generation surfer at the Southern Adelaide Surf Club, and he certainly had a flair for the sport. He was drawn to the water since before he could walk, and joined the Micrograms Junior Surf Club at the age of 7. Riding the waves along Australia's coastline, there was no feeling like it. And although Kai enjoyed just about every other sport out there, from skateboarding and soccer to basketball and biking, surfing was his one true love. By the age of 10, he was competing for Seaview Roadboard Riders, one of the oldest clubs in Australia that was founded in 1964. His family were supportive of his surfing endeavors, and very soon their weekends were filled with road trips to various surfing competitions up and down the country. But it would be Kai's love and passion for the sport that would lead to tragedy when he was just 15 years old. The young rider hit the waves with his dad at Ethel Beach on the York Peninsula. Situated approximately 100 miles west of Adelaide, the surfing spot is considered one of the best in the state when the waves are right. Ethel's Ledge provides surfers with challenging conditions, which excellent surfers like Kai relished. But on December 28, 2023, the surf wasn't very good at Ethel Beach. The sky was overcast and gray as they made their way down to the beach. But they were on a family holiday and had traveled all the way there from their home in Adelaide. They weren't going to turn back now. As Kai entered the water, a great white shark swam beneath the waves. It was on the hunt, an opportunistic feeder that continually scoured the oceans for its next meal. Sharks are more likely to attack people when skies are overcast, whether they feel bolder due to the poorer lighting concealing their approach, or whether visibility in the water is worse, therefore causing them to attack out of mistaken identity, is up for debate. But there was danger in the water that day, and Kai and his father were unaware that they were surfing their last waves together. As the afternoon wore on, Kai caught a few waves. Despite being only 15, he could surf bigger waves than his dad. He carved through the water effortlessly, enjoying the thrill of the ride. It was his happy place. But for his father, it was about so much more than the surfing. Spending time with his son, traveling for miles and miles to find the greatest surf spots, and to take Kai to all the surf competitions. It was the road trips that his father really cherished, the time he spent just chatting with his son in the car. But those days were about to come crashing down to a tragic and devastating end. It was now 1:30 in the afternoon. As Kai paddled back to beyond the breakers to catch another wave, the shark spotted him from below. Its eyes locked onto its target, a shadowy silhouette bobbing about on the surface. The shark's killer instinct kicked in, and it headed directly towards Kai. As it came closer, its mouth slightly agape, showing hundreds of sharp teeth, it powered through the water. Weighing more than 700 kilograms, 1,500 pounds, it struck Kai with such force that he was knocked from his board. The shark grabbed his leg and tugged him underwater. He gasped as he realized what was happening. In those first frantic moments, the young boy managed to cry out, alerting his father, who had just caught a wave to the rocks. When he turned back, he could see Kai thrashing about in the water. The shark had hold of him and was tearing into his leg, but Kai fought back. His father ran along the rocks, yelling at his son to swim to him. There was a tragic desperation in his voice, seeing his son in so much trouble, but being powerless to stop it. The shark briefly let go, and Kai made a dash for it. He tried to swim to his father, who was yards away, but the boy was fading. The shark had severed an artery, and he was losing blood at an incredible rate. The water turned red all around him. The energy was flowing out of him. He would have felt faint, and moments later he lost consciousness. Local surfer Tim Phillips saw the attack unfolding from the top of a cliff face. Hearing the cries of Kai's father, he turned and saw the boy was in trouble. He ran down to the sandy beach, grabbing a stranger's surfboard before diving into the water. He paddled furiously towards Kai with little regard for his own safety. As he reached Kai, he could see that he was unconscious, just floating on the surface of the ocean with his eyes closed. He then saw the terrifying dark shadow of the shark. It was still there. It was watching, and it was waiting for the moment to strike again. It had attacked its victim and was now waiting for its prey to bleed out before going back in for more. Tim grabbed Kai, but as he began to pull him through the water, the shark began circling the both of them. He estimated it to be a 13-foot-long great white. He immediately let go of Kai when he saw the shark coming for them. His heart was pounding now, and he realized just how much danger he had put himself in. He began to turn and head back for the beach, not wanting to get caught up in the imminent attack. But then he saw the shark swim away and head out towards the open water. Now was his chance to secure Kai on the surfboard and get him back to shore. He grabbed Kai once more and paddled back to the beach. He pulled him into the shallows, and those on dry land rushed in to help. The emergency services were called and arrived at the remote location shortly afterwards, but Kai lay limp on the beach. He didn't respond to CPR attempts. The shark's bite had been too powerful and too strong. In the seconds that it had taken to tear into the young surfer's leg, he had lost too much blood and sadly couldn't be revived. Kai was the third person to be attacked and killed by a shark in Australian waters that year. Back in May, schoolteacher Simon Baccanello disappeared after being attacked by a shark whilst surfing, and then in October, 55-year-old Todd Gendel lost his life to a shark attack. It was deeply concerning for so many fatal attacks to be happening that year. For Kai to have lost his life at only 15 was simply devastating for all who knew him, least of all his family. What he loved more than anything in the world, more than surfing, was his family. He had grown up surfing with his uncle, and he spent huge amounts of time with his younger brother, Jet, playing with him, fooling around and surfing with him. He was a genuine and kind-hearted soul that was popular both in and outside school. The surfing fraternity pulled together to support the family. Financial support was set up to help them through their time of grief. Their lives would never be the same again, but with the love and support from the local community and those in the surfing world, they could see a light at the end of the tunnel. An emotional memorial service was held for Kai on the beach at his favorite surf spot, Seaford Beach. His father bravely read out his obituary, showing just how proud he was of his son. He took some peace knowing that Kai literally lived life to the fullest and packed in as much as he could in his 15 years. He never had a dull moment. He was always on the go and having fun. Hundreds of surfers gathered in the sea to say a final farewell to the young surfer who still had so much to offer. Attending the service were Kai's friends from the Port Noarlunga Football Club and those from his school, Carden College. They swam out beyond the breaking waves and sat on their boards, forming a guard of honor in true surfing tradition. There they floated in one huge circle to remember the skilled surfer who will be sorely missed. In the middle of the circle were Kai's mom, dad, and younger brother Jet. They all then proceeded to chant Kai's favorite mantra, "Just one more wave, just one more wave." And just like that, the sea at Seaford, that had been calm all day, began to swell, and the waves began to grow. Perhaps Kai was listening after all, wishing his family and friends goodbye after his terrifying final affliction. You might not know the name Tamayo Perry, but you've almost certainly seen his face. The 49-year-old Hawaiian native has been featured in huge blockbusters like Pirates of the Caribbean, Blue Crush, and Hawaii Five-0. But acting was mostly a side gig for Tamayo. If he weren't so passionate about surfing and protecting lives in the ocean, he probably would have carved himself out a nice star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame eventually. But Tamayo's heart was set in the sea. He was a Hawaiian boy through and through. And actually, he made a name for himself long before the movies as a pretty formidable surfer. He didn't just win some small-time competitions. Oh no. Tamayo went up against the biggest names in the industry. In '99, he won the Pipeline Masters. He finished 5th in the Billabong Pros, and his unique tube riding style influenced later mega athletes like Jerry Lopez and Tom Carroll. And until the 23rd of June 2024, he was considered as one of the best and most decorated surfers in the entire world. But for all his accolades on the board and the big films he starred in, back home on the islands, Tamayo was just a regular dude with a wife and a permanent post as a lifeguard. He'd met Emilia on the set of the movie Blue Crush, starring Kate Bosworth. Emilia was a professional bodyboarder, and she'd moved to Hawaii to pursue a career in surfing too. Predictably, the two water babies fell head over heels for each other, and for 22 years, Emilia describes their marriage as a 22-year vacation, always exciting and joyful. Between his busy schedule, the two carved out enough time to host surfing classes for kids, and Tamayo's work as a lifeguard involved more than just getting people in trouble out of the water. He was deeply involved in training new recruits and educating the public on safety procedures on the beaches and in the water. Conserving life in the ocean, respecting the ocean that gave him so much joy, and cleaning up pollution were always at the forefront of any of his campaigns. Brands like Nissan and Coca-Cola were so enamored by his natural charm and passion that they funded some of his efforts to keep beaches safe and clean. Yet, for all the seriousness behind his efforts, Tamayo was a light-hearted, free-spirited man that thrived on making others laugh. There wasn't a run-in with a handsome surfer that wasn't punctuated with a toothy grin and a joke. On Sunday morning, Tamayo was on duty. He'd gone out bright and early to scan the beaches for swimmers and boarders in distress. But the morning was a quiet one. Even though it wasn't exactly peak tourist season, you can almost always expect the island of Mokuaia, also known as Goat Island, to have at least a couple surfers at any given time. It's not the most traveled island, but it's got great waves, and it's one of the islands where water sports enthusiasts and quite a few professional athletes prefer to ride waves because it's just a little quieter there. There hadn't been any significant shark sightings in Hawaii for months, and Tamayo, as if he tapped into a sixth sense, made an ominous post on social media just days before his death. He said that he could smell sharks in the water, almost like the seas were making themselves known to him on some deeper level than we can usually perceive. When noon came around, Tamayo was relieved of his post for a break, and since he had 2 hours to kill, he decided to ride a few waves on the very waters that he'd been watching all morning. The sun was high, the waves were good, and there was no reason to let all of those tubes go to waste for 2 whole hours. The only other people sharing that patch of surf was a pair of jet skiers who were keeping themselves behind the waves so that the 2 bodyboarders and 3 surfers could ride the waves at their highest point without fear of crashing into them. It gave the 2 gentlemen on the machines a good view of the water all the way to the sands, which ultimately was the only reason that Tamayo was even discovered at all, or his body would never have been returned to his family. They saw Tamayo enter the water and even took a few minutes to watch him disappear behind the first big swell. The 2 were Hawaiian natives too, and they knew of Tamayo and his long career as a surfer. They decided to give him a few minutes more to warm up so that they could double around and get a good view of his amazing tube riding skills from the front side of the waves. No one who knew of Tamayo would have missed an opportunity to see him in action. One of the men even saw him take a second wave and then a third. The two were about to take one last turn in the deep before heading to the front to watch the rest of Tamayo's set when the second man caught sight of something disturbing. In the third wave that Tamayo disappeared behind, the water turned a shocking shade of red. The change was instant. 1 second the deep blue Hawaiian water was just as it should be, and the next there was a spreading pool of red and a pale figure floating on the water. Just as the man pointed the scene out to his friend, they saw Tamayo's floating body yank down and disappear beneath the surface for a second, bob back up again, and the water turned even darker. The reality was starkly clear. Not only had Tamayo been attacked right inside the wave he'd been riding, the shark was still eating him. Without another word, the two gunned down on the floating surfer at full speed. Their roaring engines punctuated the air outside, and it reverberated inside the waves too, undoubtedly causing the animal to flee from the approaching engines. They saw the ghost of a shadow swimming away just beneath the surface, but it dove deeper, and they lost sight of it just 8 feet away from Tamayo. It was just too quick. They couldn't discern the species or even the size from where they were riding in from. Still in high gear, they arrived at Tamayo's side, grabbed him below the armpits and dragged him onto one of the jet skis. As they rode with him to the beach, they left a trail of red behind them. The blood was swallowed up by the ocean even as they dragged him out to the sand, and the deep blue of the Hawaiian surf returned to its former crystal clear, as if there hadn't just been a deadly attack in it at all. Already, Tamayo wasn't breathing, and the wounds on his body proved that he'd bled out somewhere between the scene and the sand. Even as quick as the response was, the damage to Tamayo's body was just too extreme for him to survive. The initial bite, it seems, happened as he was riding the wave, almost severing his left leg right above the knee. It was undoubtedly where most of the blood loss came from. The femoral artery was in tatters. Even if emergency services got him right inside the water, they wouldn't have been able to pinch the vein. There was just nothing left of it to even find in the wreckage that was his thigh. Then the predator turned back and took a chunk out of his waist. That's what the jet skiers saw when Tamayo disappeared for a second or two before bobbing back to the surface. While they waited for an ambulance to arrive, the men and the other wave riders who'd evacuated the water the moment they realized that there was a predator amongst them tried with their towels and whatever they had on them to tie the leg and to keep the rest of Tamayo's organs inside his waist cavity. It wasn't just that they were spilling out of his body. The organs were punctured, leaking their fluids out alongside the mass amounts of blood. Emergency services arrived in minutes, fast even for Hawaii's famous quick response times. But Tamayo Perry, one of the greatest surfers the world has ever known, was long dead, and athletes across the globe are left with a gaping hole in their hearts. The response from the world of extreme sports has been overwhelming, to say the least. Not surprising, since almost every surfer and bodyboarder of note has had the opportunity to meet and interact with the charming character that Tamayo was when he was alive. Not a soul who met him walked away from him without being touched deeply by his presence. For now, the whole of Hawaii is in mourning too. The islands are as quiet as the danger flags on the sands, rustling in the tropical breeze. Only the tourists are out and about, but the locals have decided to retreat from their beloved ocean for the next week while the funeral takes place. Because burying Tamayo wasn't as cut and dried as funerals usually are, with his fellow sportsmen flying in from all over the world, and most Hawaiians also in attendance, it's been decided to wait a week until everyone arrives, and the rather complicated arrangements can be made to accommodate the scores of people who will come out to bid their hero a proper send-off. One thing's certain, Tamayo is a legend, and legends are remembered forever after their final affliction.